by Moses. So let me just pause here for a moment. I think that the proper way to try to understand how these two things fit together, you've got God hardening his heart, and then sometimes, in fact, much less often, but sometimes it will say Pharaoh hardened his own heart, and it'll go back and say God hardened his heart. Well, how do you understand this? Well, I think the simplest way to understand this is that both things are happening at the same time every time. In other words, let me use an analogy. No analogy is perfect. This is a human illustration for what is beyond our understanding. But this is a simple illustration that I've used many times in the past. If you're here and it's warming up in Georgia these days, you could feel that the summer is coming, our 6-month summer in Georgia. And as the sun is getting warmer and warmer, imagine a hot July 100-degree, you know it's coming, 100-degree afternoon. And let's say that you've got some wet clay. I have no idea why, but you've got some wet clay nearby. And you take the clay outside, wet clay, very malleable. You know, you can shape it, turn it into some pottery if you wanted to do that. I know Jerry might be doing some pottery this summer, some pottery
Absolutely.
lessons. So you take the clay outside, you throw it down on the hot asphalt. 100-degree weather, if you're barefoot, you're going to burn your feet, boiling hot. You throw this wet clay down on the ground. And you could say that the sun is going to harden the clay. It's not wrong to say the sun is going to harden the clay. But we must understand what we mean by that. We don't mean that the sun creates dryness and puts it in the clay. You see that? The sun is not putting dryness in the clay. It's not putting dryness. It's not like the clay is just sitting there and God puts, no. What does the sun do? It causes evaporation, right? And the moisture that's in the clay dries out and evaporates up into the sky. It's removed from the clay, and now the clay is now left in its natural state apart from that water, right? The clay is simply what it is without water, which becomes what? Rock hard, right? It was hard, right? It was hardened. You can no longer form pottery out of it. It's now useless. You just throw it out. It's now ruined. Okay, so think of it like this. Every human heart is like that. God, if you think of the moisture there as God's common grace, just the grace that he gives us a conscience so that we feel bad when we do certain things. Even non-Christians feel pangs of conscience. So God, in his common grace, keeps us from being as hard-hearted as we could be, right? By providing the moisture of his common grace in this analogy, right? And if God is to simply remove his common grace, it's called restraining grace. If God simply removes his restraining grace from any of our hearts, we're going to become more like who we are apart from God. And is that better or worse? Every time we become more hard-hearted. When God steps back and begins to remove the moisture of his common grace from our heart, I become who I am naturally, which is in my dead, fallen state, I become more inveterately proud, more irritable, more boastful, more self-centered, more egocentric, more obsessed with myself. Like, that's just what we do when God removes. So God can simply remove his restraining grace. In no way is he violating Pharaoh's will. He's simply giving Pharaoh more of Pharaoh. That's all he's doing. God is simply saying, okay, I have a purpose to back away. I want to remove my restraining grace. And now Pharaoh's heart becomes more what it is by nature, which is fully arrogant and proud. And it stiffens the neck. And of its own choice, it says, I'm God and there is no other. I will not bow the knee to this Yahweh. I will not do it. I'm going to do what I want to do. Thank you very much. And that's who all of us are at rock bottom, left to ourselves. And so it's only by God's grace anyone isn't as evil as they could be. And if God were to remove grace, listen, Pharaoh's will is not being violated. He is choosing of what he wants to do in that moment, which is to sin. And yet God is simply removing restraint and allowing him more of what his fallen nature wants. So who's hardening Pharaoh's heart? The answer is it God or Pharaoh? The answer is yes. It just depends on what you mean. God is removing restraining grace. Pharaoh is deliberately choosing to harden his own heart, and those are happening simultaneously, and there's no violation of will. God is simply giving Pharaoh over to himself. Thoughts on, I know these analogies are not perfect, but thoughts on those kinds of things?
Well, thinking of the opposite, I think, is important too, because Scripture is very clear on a number of occasions the Lord opened somebody's heart. And again, God doesn't owe that to anyone. Like you said, if he just leaves us to ourselves, gives us more of ourselves, he's not violating any principle of justice. He's actually, he's perfectly right to do that. And so we have to keep in mind, God doesn't owe this to Pharaoh. He doesn't owe Pharaoh a soft heart. He doesn't owe any of us a soft heart. And I think the reason why this matters is a lot of times I think our understanding of sin is woefully inadequate. We don't think we're that bad. We don't think our potential is that bad. We just don't think of sin the way we should, and therefore we have a diminished view of God, and we think, well, God can't do something like that. No, God absolutely can, because we are sinners, and if God gave us what we actually deserved right now, apart from Christ, we'd all die and go to hell. I mean, let's just be honest. God doesn't owe us anything good. And so every breath we take is a moment of grace, and God can do with us as he pleases for his purposes. And yeah, that, like we've said before, this cuts across the grain of our self-sufficiency and in a sense, our self-idolatry of wanting to exalt ourselves to a place the Bible doesn't. We have to submit to this and realize what God is doing to Pharaoh is just, and it is right, and it is good in terms of who God is. He's not sinning. He's not doing wrong. If God hardens our hearts, he's only giving us over to what we already are. If he opens our hearts and softens our hearts, then he's giving us contrary to what we deserve, which is the very definition of grace. But he owes that to no one. And again, I'm not trying to be harsh with that. That's just the biblical reality. God owes us nothing good. Nothing. And if we get anything that's not what we fully deserve, then every day we're getting better than we deserve. Even the most wicked of sinners that we would look at in this world, maybe a tyrant who, is like Pharaoh doing all kinds of wicked things, he every day is getting better than he deserves. So to say that God hardened Pharaoh's heart is not to say God's doing some horrible injustice. Pharaoh's still breathing. That's better than Pharaoh deserves. And so God is simply, like you said, just giving Pharaoh more of himself, and there's nothing wrong for God to do that. He doesn't owe Pharaoh any different.
And another analogy, these are flawed analogies. Just say someone's holding this one almost sounds too mechanical, but say someone's holding a bowling ball like 5 feet in the air, okay? If the person lets go of the bowling ball will fall. Well, unless you're in outer space, right? If you're in outer space, you let go of the bowling ball, it won't fall. So let's think about that for a second. If you think of Pharaoh's heart as like that bowling ball, okay, God's holding it. When God removes his restraining grace, it's not the removal that actually makes it fall. It's gravity that makes it fall, right? Now, think about this. If my sinful desires are always dragging me down, my sinful impulses by my nature are pulling me down like gravity. It makes me want to become more sinful. God can restrain that and lift me up. He can raise me far above my sinful impulses. But when God lets go, it is my sin that drags me down. It is not God sinning for me or making me sin. It's simply me getting what I want. The pull of my own sin is what brings me down. And similarly, when God steps back and releases Pharaoh in that sense, Pharaoh goes down because his sin is pulling him down. When people say, so does Pharaoh not have a choice? No, Pharaoh has a choice. He loves his sin. He is choosing exactly what he wants. At no point is Pharaoh being forced to do something against what he desires. His deepest desires are being revealed. And his deepest desires, which is true of all of us naturally, is my own pride, my own self, my own self-centeredness. And so, he's got all the freedom to choose in the world right now, but his freedom is also bound by his sin nature, and he wants what is wrong. And that's fundamental to who he is.
Yeah, I would just come back to what Greg was saying. Again, it's like somebody would say, like you have often said, we're shocked by the wrong things in the Bible. I think it's so true. And people will say, how in the world could God harden Pharaoh's heart? Well, the real question is, why doesn't God harden every single person's heart? And then you take it to yourself again, like, how in the world was God gracious to me? Like, my heart was hard towards God in my early 20s. How in the world could God soften my heart, give me new hungers for him, and save me? And I think you come to a story like this, and I think you can be amazed by the gospel if you view it correctly. If you were shocked by the right things in the Bible. All of us should have had our hearts hardened, but many have been saved. That's extraordinary grace, and I think it's just a great time to remember the gospel, kind of what Greg was getting at too.
I think when we think this, we think about John the Baptist saying in John 3:30, let me decrease, let him increase. I think that's all part of this. We want to take away our sinful desires, have less of those, and we want God to dominate our thinking more. Passive and active